Good afternoon to everyone. I am Marie-Lisa Dacanay. I'm the president of the Institute for Social Entrepreneurship in Asia. And I'd like to welcome you to our webinar series, which we have called COVID-19 Social Enterprise Response and Visioning Effort in Asia. There are two objectives of this webinar series. The first is to share our experiences and responses uh, to COVID-19, no? Share the responses of social enterprises as well as social enterprise resource institutions to COVID-19 towards networking and collaboration so that we could develop a responsive recovery program for social enterprises in the region. The second objective is to evaluate and reconfigure the social entrepreneurship platforms to accelerate the sustainable development goals that we were actually about to launch when the pandemic happened. Sometime in March, we were about to co-convene with the UN SCAP, the United Nations Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, a social enterprise advocacy and leveraging conference where we were supposed to develop and launch social entrepreneurship SDG acceleration platform. These were being explored with the UN system because at the time there was already an evaluation that the sustainable development goals of zero poverty, reduced inequality, and sustainability were not going to be achieved under the situation or the strategies that were being pursued at the time by government and stakeholders in the region. And the reason why social enterprises were an interesting partner to the UN was because we were seen, the social enterprise sector was seen as an accelerator to the sustainable development goals. No? So the sustainable development goals, that the acceleration platforms for the sustainable development goals that we were about to launch in March included a platform for sustainable livelihoods and women's economic empowerment, a platform for health for all, education and decent work, sustainable consumption and production, as well as rural revitalization and youth. No? These were platforms where social entrepreneurs and social enterprise resource institutions were coming together to actually work with governments as well as the business sector to accelerate the sustainable development goals in the region. So all of this will lead up to a conference in September, on September 16 to 17, 2020, a virtual conference where we hope to develop and launch this reconfigured platform. Reconfigured because we hope that they would not only respond to the impact of COVID-19, no, and the need for social enterprises to recover given COVID-19's impact on them and the poor who are their primary stakeholders, as well as reposition again the social enterprise sector in Asia to become partners in the acceleration of the Sustainable Development Goals. With that, I'd like to welcome each and every one of you to this webinar series.
Sa lahat, and to all our participants today, thank you for joining us this afternoon. And thank you also to ISEA, Institute for Social Entrepreneurship in Asia, for providing this opportunity for its members to share our thinking and our experiences, our practice on the ground, for all of us to learn from and share also everybody's experiences. I will be the moderator for this meeting. I am Carla Santos. I'm from the Philippine Rural Reconstruction Movement. PRRM is one of the bigger NGOs in the Philippines, and we will be introducing our organization much more later on. For this afternoon, we will have two speakers from our Board of Trustees and from the Operations Unit of PRRM. Our first speaker, of course, the title of our conversations is Food Security, Sustainable Agriculture, and Social Entrepreneurship in Times of Disruption, like what we have now, and towards sustainability and resilience. So this is this is the theme of our conversations for this afternoon. So our first speaker is the vice chairperson of the Board of Trustees of the Philippine Rural Reconstruction Movement. This is Mr. Ed De La Torre, Edicio De La Torre. We call him Ed. And the second speaker is the executive director of PRRM also, and he is Marlon Palomo. For the next 50 to 60 minutes, they will be sharing with us PRRM's thinking and practice in the areas of food security and social entrepreneurship, with sustainable agriculture as a basic element of both these themes. So they'll present one after the other, and our open discussion will be the following 20 to 30 minutes after their presentations. Firstly, I would like to also, after welcoming all of us, I would like to acknowledge also some of the trustees of PRRM who are joining us today. Maybe Ed and Marlon will be acknowledging them also later. So we'll start. Just to repeat the guidelines from Gomer earlier, they asked everyone everyone's muted. Oh, thank you very much. So let's go straight to our first speaker, so we'll have more time for our exchanges later on. Is Ed. He's educator, mentor, writer. You should read his blog. Paints beautifully with such vibrant colors. His husband, father, and grandfather. He's been with PRM for the last 3 decades, I think. He's working with us and working with our partner communities. I would like to introduce her. Let's welcome Ed
Yeah,
De La
thank
Torre.
you, Kai.
Sir?
Good afternoon to our colleagues here in the Philippines and in other countries in the ISEA network, part of this webinar series. I think 2 months ago, Lisa Dakanay called me and told me about this webinar series. And when we were discussing different topics, I told her I really like to pursue the issue of food security because that is really something. I mean, we've always been thinking of it, but right now it has really hit us in a much deeper and more urgent and also strategic way. And so it says perfect because he says one of the 5 platforms that I say is trying to develop is on food security. But in addition to that, she said, and I agree, that we should not just be discussing ideas or advocacies. We should share some of the experiences. No? Some maybe with some state where most of us are development NGOs. Unlike ISIS primarily, I think already social entrepreneurs and social enterprises plus advocates. PRRM is primarily a non-government organization, a development NGO. So it's only now that we are trying to put together these 2 items of sustainable development and working with local communities and small producers to develop them also into social enterprises and maybe later aggregate them to be part of a more sustainable and larger value chain. I prepared the division of work we agreed on is that Marlon, who is the executive director and really runs the operations of the Philippine Rural Reconstruction Movement, will do a longer presentation, maybe around 30 minutes. I'll do a much shorter one if I can keep to my time, around 20 minutes, even less. And I have a few PowerPoint slides. When it comes to PowerPoint, there was one time when I was younger, when I heard the critique of, I think it was Guy Kawasaki, he called himself the evangelist of Apple Company. And he says there was a lot of criticism about death by PowerPoint, where people put too many things on their slides rather than talking and using the slides to just support what they are saying. And so he said, I'll give you a 10, 20, 30 rule. On 10 slides, maximum 20 minutes explanation and no font size smaller than 30, especially for older people. Now I'll do that better. I have only 8 slides. Hopefully keep within 20 minutes. But there is, I think, 1 or 2 slides which are smaller type. Anyway, let me proceed to sharing on the screen the slides I prepared for you. So this is the first. Although this is in the context of COVID and our response, clearly the SDG, which is the larger and more strategic framework where not only governments but civil society organizations who engage with government critically, sometimes cooperatively, sometimes in opposition and disagreement. But in general, it's so difficult to get some working framework and consensus about what are we after. And so all of us, I think, in one way or the other, use the SDG as a framework, whether for our own orientation, but also especially for advocacy, both at the local, national, and global level. So, but among these 17, which is very difficult to memorize, for this afternoon, I'll be focusing primarily on SDG 2, although that is really an integral part of the whole 17. And there are some UN agencies and advocacy groups who interpret one SDG goal and link it to all the others. And I'll try to do a little of that. But the idea is I added not just food security, I call it sustainable, partly in reference to the sustainable development goals, but also because food security can be kind of erratic. You know, sometimes you have a lot, sometimes less, especially in emergencies. And with all this crisis now about global food chains, imports, schedules. So the whole idea now is how to develop something more sustainable, not just in terms of working with nature and not ravishing our natural resources, but also sustaining it so that it is not off and on, stop, start. Later, I would add a second kind of adjective and concept, which is we would want not only sustainable, but also resilient on the premise that we can't predict everything. But from what point of view are we going to discuss, am I going to discuss the framework of sustainable food security, which we are trying to call it a rooted advocacy for social. First of all, I was informed by Lisa, and we discussed also at PRRM, that in addition to our local work, we do want to advocate towards higher authorities, those with more resources, those with more power, those with more responsibility. But the idea is not just to be advocates by ourselves, being very clever, having links with them, but rooting our advocacy, not just in our direct experience, because we can't do much of that, we cannot move to, but rooted especially in our local partners, in the primary, the small farmers, but also other players, including development NGOs. So the focus of my presentation is this threefold, no? Security, but from the point of view of a development NGO that is trying to promote social enterprises and rooting our advocacy primarily on the needs and the ideas and experiences of the small primary producers whom we help aggregate eventually to be part of a bigger value chain. Now, the SDGs have been there, but with COVID, at least based on our Philippine experience and whatever I've been reading or watching on television and through social media, the most immediate consequence of COVID is, in general, the fear that the SDG, there was already a debate on whether they are really achievable given the inequalities, the imbalances, the withdrawal from global collaboration by many countries and leaders in the North. But in particular, there is the fear that the SDG goals, both of poverty, the first one, but especially health, which was a real concern, literally existentially for a lot of us, but especially also hunger, because after the initial, you know, food aid into our, for example, in the Philippines, into our third month of lockdown, where the economy hasn't really quite restarted, the expression of poverty is hunger. You know? There was a quick survey by a coalition of CSOs and the private sector in some of the urban poor communities in the national capital region. And the findings were really quite alarming. Almost maybe 90% missed one meal or so. But almost 60% maybe having more than a day. On the other hand, and I like to balance it on the other hand, another uh, private foundation who is working with us and also with local government units reported that in a remote province in Bicol called Sorsogon, they had already succeeded in promoting a diversified family farm, but this is rural. And in that same town of Pilar, majority of families also suffered hunger, also suffered not just loss of income, but literally no food. But this particular family that had successfully developed that not only did not suffer hunger, they were able, in fact, to share. An equal situation, that there are possibilities to, even in this crisis, to address the issue of food security. So what is the other consequence of COVID for a lot of us? Well, generally they say focus on essentials. When government locks down, they say, oh, which part of the economy are essential and therefore you're allowed to travel. Secondly, we must adapt, but we must also innovate. And the third, which is most important, as I mentioned, we have to think beyond now, beyond the first months. What about not even super long term, but to the end of this year, until the vaccine comes, until the economy revives. And it's not just COVID we're going to worry about. When the monsoon season comes, we'll have typhoons. And then you might have the reverse later of drought. We still have internal armed conflicts in the Philippines. So there are disruptions, there's fear. Government is trying to push an anti-terrorism. So there's so many concerns. So it's sustainable. It's not just sustainability to continue something that it will be more or less okay, except to stretch it over time, to be able to recover from setbacks. And we must anticipate and build our capacity in the same way that for health, instead of waiting just for vaccines or waiting for cure and treatment, we have to build our own immunity and build our own resilience. So those are the first points I want to make on sustainable food security in a time of COVID. Now, going back to the next few slides are just my attempt to synthesize the key points that are already there in the United Nations literature, in advocates. A lot of them I just picked from the web. I just made nice slides from them so that at least you can recall them easier. Now, zero hunger, of course, starts with hunger, meaning no malnutrition, especially for children. But the idea is beyond that, to achieve food security and improve nutrition. We have a saying in our native language, which is called busog. Busog means you feel you have enough calories, your stomach is full, it's not feeling empty. But then it's not enough to be busog, we say, you must also be lusog. Lusog is healthy, which is really happening now. Noodles, canned goods, all kinds. Maybe they fill your stomach, but people worry after a while the consequences of malnutrition, you know, especially for the children. And the special emphasis in the SDG 2 is not just food security as a system, but a special focus on sustainable agriculture. Because in the end, uh, where will food come from? They might have all kinds of processing, and a lot of young people in urban areas, when you ask them where does food come from, they will say from the grocery or from the mall. I mean, they have no idea, a lot of them, of where it first comes from. No? The primary sources, no? Especially the small producers, the farmers, the fisher folk, even the immediate primary processing. No? So zero hunger is related really to the issue of sustainable food security. Now, I I will I will have more text later, but I like this zero hunger challenge, who simplified 2.1, 2.24. It's 2.5, the indicators, and they have 3 4 systems. So the first one really at the end is to have access to adequate food, healthy diets for all people all year round, with a special focus on children. But then you need to adapt food systems to eliminate loss or waste of food. I'm speaking from Metro Manila, the national capital region, which is around during the day around 12 million out of the 110 million Filipinos. And the big cities, they are not food producers, no? And other than our impact on producers on how we pay, what we buy, what we eat, there's really a lot of wastage, no? And loss of food. Some had calculated before that, for example, in rice, which is a big issue, the staple food, that if we could eliminate the loss of rice, you know, extra rice thrown or badly cooked and all that, that we would reduce our shortage of production and lessen our imports by almost 6 to 7%. That's how much more other kinds of food. But then beyond, even further back to the system, one of the emphasis now, even though COVID is primarily, the figures and the stories are urban, you know, then people realize, yeah, what about the rural, both in terms of migration, that's why they come to the city because of poverty there, but also later, where will the sources of food, where will be possibilities of employment, later we will be discussing in processing and come from. And then the full big system is from production to consumption. Those are the two ends. Actually, there are so many more, especially when you talk of social enterprises. As one entrepreneur, a fairly large one, but who thinks social, says it's a whole ecosystem. Your own daughter, who is a millennial, who is primarily good in marketing, web-based, she's part of the food system. She's not simply a producer or a consumer. Marketers, the transport, the logistics, the packaging. You know? So there's a whole large system. And I think when we talk of social enterprise, we tend to be biased in favor of primary production and some processing, and then towards the end, distribution and marketing. There are many in between that social enterprises can fill, so that we will have not only a sustainable and resilient system, but we will have players that are not just the big ones and many, many small ones, but many in between, no? Small, medium, and eventually even some larger enterprises that are social enterprises. This is from the United Nations official literature. So it says, in the light of the pandemic's effects, the food supply chains must be kept, well, running to mitigate the risk of large shocks. They do have a bias, and I immediately comment on that. Third in the list is immediately keep the global food trade growing. Well, yes, 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 but I don't think that is our highest priority at this point. I think it's more the fourth and the fifth. Keep the domestic supply chain gears moving and support smallholder farmers' ability to increase food production. But before that, obviously, there's the more immediate one. The food needs of the vulnerable populations. That is really social protection, there's social welfare. A lot of that is really government. Although in the Philippines, and I think in all countries in the world, the inadequacy of government support, no matter how well-meaning, established, maybe well-funded, has had to be accompanied by a lot of private and not necessarily corporate, even private, middle class, young professionals, neighborhoods who really give food, voluntarily, not as an exchange, but give of what they can to the vulnerable populations. The dilemma there is how to sustain it after 1 month, 2 months, when our own incomes are much lesser. So there has to be social protection programs. Otherwise, even while we discuss the system, the sustainability, there are more immediate and felt needs. That is the dilemma actually of a lot of us who have been more into development work. Before there was a strict difference between humanitarian relief and sustainable development, but that has become now a continuum because your entry, you will be part of those who will have to respond to the immediate needs of people, especially if there are resources from your own and others. But we must make sure that it doesn't leave them and reinforce their helplessness, their dependence, but that in the process, no matter how difficult, we slowly help them recover and develop their self-confidence, their capacity to work together, and be part of a more long-term sustainable solution. After this, yeah, this is the one that I said I violated my own rule. This is less than 30 points. But the first 2.1, 2.2 is more about malnutrition and ensuring there is adequate food. But if you look at 2.3, 2.4, this is where I think the heart of the link between organizations like the Philippine Rural Reconstruction Movement and organizations like yours listening who are more into development work, now have to focus on when it comes to food security. So the first one, we have to increase the productivity. The UN goal is to double the productivity, but not just product, but incomes, especially with small producers, particularly women, indigenous people, family farms, fishers. How? Traditional problem, secure and equal access to land. I remember that old saying about technology that you give a man fish, you feed him for a day, teach him how to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. But someone says, yeah, but what if he has to access to fishing grounds? And secondly, what if he has access, but it has been already overfished? So it's not a simple issue. While food is the focus, access to land, to other resources and inputs, credit, technology, markets, and non-farm employment. I think it was before the idea of sustainable livelihoods with an emphasis on S, so that especially the small producers are not dependent on only one source or only one crop or just farm incomes. There should be also non-farm incomes. Secondly, well, it's already alluded to the whole idea of climate change, resilience, the other disasters, including soil quality. The focus that we had used was from seed to farm to table. Someone was saying, no, seed soil, not just seed, soil and water, farm to table. And then finally, which the reference, well, understandably, a lot of hybrid seeds have led to much greater productivity, but sometimes to the point where, like in the Philippines, there would even be laws that will prevent the traditional practices of farmers developing their own seeds, exchanging them, making it a crime if they are not registered and uh, certified. So the whole idea of maintaining a genetic diversity of seeds, no, and different plants and animals, including wild species, through sound and so the whole idea of food security, while it starts with actual consumption, malnutrition, really are talking of a much larger system where a lot of us development NGOs who might not be into direct feeding or direct relief work have a lot of very valuable contribution, but we must see ourselves as part of a system. Again, quoting that friend of ours who say, Ed, think of it as a whole ecosystem. We are not just between producers and consumers. There's a whole set of different players. And I say that also because the same diversity and variety has to be addressed by social enterprises. There will be different kinds of social enterprises for food security. Now, when I was researching for this, and when I told Lisa about it, she said, focus on social enterprise and food security. Don't bring us to the big and raging debate on food security versus food sovereignty. But for me, it's not this big system debate. It's rather that the idea of food security is simply as having enough food, adequate food, affordable food, healthy food, does not address directly the system. And while there are systems at all levels, including the UN emphasis on both global and local, I think food sovereignty has a bias toward local national, but not to the extent of saying everything global is wrong or everything regional is wrong. Realistically, there will not only are systems already there are exchanges that have to happen, there is trade and all that, but sometimes ideologically, there is a thinking that that is the most, that's the preferred system. A good friend of ours who recently died, and unfortunately, Bobby Berzoso, I remember him telling, he's an engineer. He says, making it rational, including long distance travel where it's cheaper to where he says maybe it has an argument for efficiency. But there is a counter argument there against the whole idea. Like he says, when you have a big boat, you compartmentalize it so that in case there's a hole in one, water will rush in and not the whole boat will be swamped. I think that has been one of the observations about how COVID and the consequent reaction has made us realize this advocacy of a fully, preferably integrated global system is fragile and fraught with problems because not only of leaders who will withdraw to national interests against others, but simply this whole issue again. There are different levels of integration and maximization and efficiency. And there is this whole element always, I said, of mitigating and ensuring that we are resilient. So the whole idea of food sovereignty simply has a bias on food and people, food producers, localized food system, work with nature. And it's not simply kind of romanticizing traditional knowledge, but rather making sure that this traditional knowledge is not just preserved, but codified and improved and interacts with other knowledge that comes from different disciplines. That's true whether in health, from established allopathy, Western medicine, to naturopathy. So again, it's not either or, but rather where can they complement one another? The same thing with knowledge, no? The so-called scientific versus social knowledge should not counterpose. Social is scientific. You know, in the same way that good science should eventually be social and should not be the privilege of only a few experts. So, but especially when it comes to agriculture, when people say people think it's a matter of your fertilizer and your technology. There is so much that's dependent on nature about agriculture, the soil, the weather, and accumulative business. That's why we talk it agriculture. It's a culture, a cumulative knowledge and practices. And unfortunately, even agricultural colleges and researchers have not devoted enough time to documenting, codifying, and honoring you know, the possibilities of this local indigenous knowledge system. So it's not an either or, we want both. We see there are local, national, and global aspects of food security. I'm down to my last two. Now, um, when we rootedness among development workers like us in Philippine Rural, work with local communities and local producers, primary producers. But we are not simply talking of self-sufficient autarky, produce for your own consumption. We do want them to produce for exchange, produce surplus, because they can't produce everything they need. And how will they pay for that if they do not produce more from their primary production or even get non-farm income? So the whole idea of once you go to exchange, then you're talking of enterprise. So that's this space for social enterprises approach, whether individual, household-based, or clusters, or cooperatives. So I put different sizes. When we were discussing yesterday, preliminary, I said, well, the impression a lot of people have is that social enterprises are small ones, micro and small. And Lisa said, no, there are social enterprises of all sizes, especially there are some big cooperatives. So it's not just that big business is big and all the rest of us are left to micro and small and even very few medium. So I'd say there are even fairly large enterprises who are trying to be social in the sense of having your triple bottom line. But clearly that will happen only if our work with the primary producers is both for their own consumption and for exchange. I'll give you a simple example. In a southern municipality in Zamboanga, out of 44 villages, 33 are indigenous people and their primary staple food is cassava. So the mayor there happened to want to promote sustainable organic agriculture, which initially among some advocates is immediately pitched as produce organic because there is a middle class market. They will pay more for that. And he's saying that that's a wrong approach because the whole idea is first let the Subanans, the indigenous, say, okay, what do you need for just your own food security? If it is primary staple food. Now, instead of buying fertilizer or pesticides and going into debt, especially if you cannot sell, why don't you use practices so that at least you guarantee what you need for your own nutrition? But then he says, they cannot produce everything. So we will help them also develop some cash crops and then assist them to negotiate with buyers and even processors for that. So the whole idea is to have both for own consumption and exchange. But there is a tendency to critique family-sized farms, small farmers, because they don't have enough for exchange. The whole idea is even if they had none, especially in times like COVID where the system breaks down, if they have enough for their own immediate consumption and some local exchange, that is food security. But clearly, we have to think also in terms of others, including us in the urban areas. As someone told me once, Ed, if all of us in the rural areas are forbidden to transfer our produce to you, you will all starve. And I said, no, not quite. There will be importers who will import from other countries, which is actually the other dilemma. That so many big urban centers, the distribution systems are so more geared for importing, processing, and distributing rather than supporting buying and processing from the internal sources. That's another issue. No? So, and then on top, well, this is like our own initiative among each other, local exchange, market relationship. Clearly, there's a big role for government because first of all, there are certain infrastructure, farm to market roads, electricity, including communications, information, training, but especially policies. If there are disincentives to internal production and all incentives are for importation, if there are incentives for greater and greater processing and disincentive for primary production. I give a simple example. In the Philippines, primary agricultural production is not taxed. But when I who are those who are producing virgin coconut oil in one province? They told me, we know Ed, some co-ops, but don't tell them you are coming for a research and they worry that you are with government. Why? Because once there is some processing, they are taxed. So I said, why is there such a disincentive for value adding? No? So these are some of the issues that there will be policy advocacy needed. No? Finally, and this is a particularly Lisa's request that the social enterprise network in the Philippines over time have come up with a proposed legislation called Present Poverty Reduction through Social Enterprise. And it's still there. It just passed, but there's an increasing support for it because we really need not just incentives, but we need the kind of government support so we can identify where are the gaps which are best filled, no, between the primary producers and the large enterprises and markets by social entrepreneurs, whether they're individual, partnerships, cooperatives, or larger networks. So this is an example
period. In these fields together with our partner organizations. Sir Marlon, welcome po.
Hey, thank you, Kai. And I would also like to thank Ed for the framework discussion. Mine will be more operational, but I'm afraid, Ed, that I don't have 8 slides. I think I would have many. And as you know, it's really difficult to present after that kind of presentation. But then I would like to say good afternoon to each and everyone, to ISAIA members, ISAIA stakeholders, to our guests, PRRM board members. I saw Ambassador Chito earlier. I hope still there, and to all of you, good afternoon. And as I said, mine will be more operational in PRRM, and the title of my presentation will be Seed to Table, a conversation around food security, sustainable agriculture, social entrepreneurship in times of disruption and towards sustainability and resilience. Kai, would you, but allow me to introduce my organization first. Kai, next slide, please. PRRM, or Philippine Rural Reconstruction Movement. It is founded in 1952 and probably one of the oldest, if not the oldest, non-government development organization around mass education and what we call livelihood and health, and generally to flip rural communities out of poverty, because when PRRM was established, there were poverty everywhere. And as you can see, the convergence of the fourfold, we have education to combat illiteracy, literacy and self-government to combat civic inertia, livelihood, to battle poverty, health, combat diseases. When PRRM was revitalized in 1980s after the dictatorial regime, we added people, and this is the ecosystem approach to mean environmental sustainability. Next slide, Kai, please. And when it was revitalized in 1986, we started doing programs again. We started with food and nutrition. This is also around food security to address famine in Negros Occidental. And Negros Occidental is within within Western Visayas, and the group of Visayas there was famine because of the collapse of the sugar industry. And eventually, through 1988, democratization that later was enhanced to become the Sustainable Rural District Development Program, which is essentially an integrated area development model whose goal is for the marginalized sectors to have access and control over resources and decision making. The PRRM especially in communities where we operate and in Philippine communities. One is that access to food and the basic commodities for household consumption became difficult, especially in the first month of the pandemic. Put the whole of Luzon under an enhanced community quarantine, and this is an expression of the lockdowns, similar of the lockdowns probably in your countries. And second impact of the pandemic is that the access to market to sell farm produce was constrained. Poor families' income generating capacity was also further reduced, including their ability to purchase basic commodities that are not locally produced. Women fishers as well, and farmers and their small agribusiness were affected by reduced links to markets and buyers and by limited public transportation. Actually, during the lockdowns, there was no public transportation to begin with. And if you have private cars and vehicles, you will have to secure passes when you cross municipalities after municipalities. And eventually, there was this food pass, and even with the food pass, the small producers and farmers cooperatives and women's micro enterprises, which have limited resources and capacities, may not be able to effectively engage the market in this kind of a situation. Current practices in the food value chain need to be overhauled in the short and in the long term. We all know that the pandemic will be around not for shorter times, but will be with us, I think, in the medium term. So food security will be a challenge globally, not just locally. So the pandemic on PRRM subsidiary and assisted social enterprises. Next slide, Kai, please. Next slide. Well, a number of the social enterprises that PRRM helped, created, and assisted, one of which is the Cooperative Anglikas. This is nature cooperative of sustainable agriculture farmers in northern Nueva Ecija, which processes, and markets naturally grown rice. Because of the pandemic and because of the strict measures, it missed delivery in March, and therefore there was an income loss until it revitalizes in April. For the other social enterprise, Vizcaya Fresh Incorporated in the uplands of Nueva Vizcaya, and this is a social enterprise, agricultural social enterprise into the production and trading of organic fruits and vegetables. Actually, caught in the lockdown midway to Manila was a delivery of fully loaded van of vegetables, and there was no recourse but to go back and try to sell the produce or the products to the local market, and sought the assistance of the Department of Agriculture such that able to deliver up to the next provinces in Isabela and Cagayan. It was able to sell actually after more than a week. And I would like just to say that the pandemic came during the peak season for vegetable production, and hence a lot of spoilage at farm level. You can hear that in the news. And another is that we're trying to pilot integrated farming models at the PRRM Global Center in the Cavite campus of PRRM with the Institute of International Institute of Rural Reconstruction. And because of the lockdowns, our staff who the place and were lockdowns at their homes, you know, the crops and harvest were harvested by neighboring households. Well, it's good. People have food at least from that farm, but it's also an income loss in as far as our engagement is concerned. Another the social enterprise of PRRM in Camiguin province. Camiguin province is an island province in Mindanao, and this is mainly reliant in tourism and tourism activity. Quezon City, metropolitan Manila, which is the epicenter of the pandemic. And we, as also an enterprise and an income earning activity, we rent out spaces and conference facilities to civil society organizations, to corporate entities, and government as well. But because of the lockdown, there are no more renters, only those that rent spaces for office buildings. So therefore, again, a loss of revenue for PRRM. Another social enterprise that was created by PRRM to assist the marketing of the products of its partner people's organization and other assisted communities, what we call rural reconstruction trading, and almost zero walk-in buyers. There was minimal revenue and no acquisition of new stocks. Another investment of PRRM and another envisioned social enterprise to be a people's bank was the Lagawi Highlands Rural Bank. We call it Banco Lagawi. During the lockdown, it continued to provide banking services as a frontline institution in all of its 4 branches in northern Luzon and in the Cordillera. From January to March, it was able to register a positive income, but negative income in April. And it employs only a skeletal workforce that sustains banking services in all of its branches. So how did PRRM and the programs of PRRM, its assisted partner organization, transition to responding to the pandemic, and how local actions focused on sustaining farming activities, therefore securing food and reviving small enterprises. Next slide, guys. The model of PRRM in sustainable agriculture is the what we call organic and diversified integrated farming systems, or ODIPs. And this is a model around farm entrepreneurship and food security. And even before the pandemic, due to our realization that the country is a disaster-prone country in the ring of fire, openly visited by typhoons, the third most vulnerable nation. So we convened and take stock of our sustainable agriculture practice and position the practices firmly around food security and farm entrepreneurship. And I think during that time, we included agri-ecotourism as also an income generating activities in agriculture. So next slide, Kai. So during the early period of the quarantine, I think this is in April, also through ISEA with Lisa and the PRRM partners, we engage the Department of Agriculture's plant program. We access seeds. We develop a seed banking, seed distribution for food security concept, and with three social enterprise organization in agriculture as partners. And in this context, the ODIPS model, or the diversified model of PRRM, will be enhanced. And the seed to table agriculture value chain strategy for food security will be further developed. So that is, those are the partner agencies in this piloting. Cooperative ng Likas, I mentioned already, Samalenyo Organico Producers Cooperative in Bataan. We also partnered with Gracia Plena Social Action Center, and of course the family farms that are actually involved in integrated farming systems as well. Next slide, guys. I think this is another development in the model of PRRM, family farms and enterprises photos. This is to, of course, secure family consumption and sharing to locally. So that's basically this, which was temporarily suspended, but now with the quarantines easing down and graduating to probably to a more relaxed general community quarantine and eventually modified community quarantine to transitioning to the new normal, it is slowly being revived. So next slide, guys. To respond to the critical issues in Camiguin, we conducted studies, we conducted sessions with our partners there, and we started to shift to community livelihoods from ecotourism and simply microfinance operation to household food production, processing, and food deliveries to households. Next slide, please. We are now a farm modules at the PRRM Global Center, as I mentioned earlier, included ecological solid waste management, recycle, reuse, PET bottles, and other related plastic waste materials to the eco nurseries. And also, I would like to discuss this in the fishery sector. We organize SAMO. This is a coastal fisheries organization in Bataan, which is also a peninsula and a coastal province. What is good in this model is that it even continued to process and sell locally during the height of the pandemic through an online system of ordering and door-to deliveries by municipal fisher folk to the population in Orion with fair pricing. And they managed to secure a support from the local government and the Department of Agriculture. And what is special is these women, they exercise and in the business. So next slide. And these are pictures of the women in marketing of fish cuts and processed products. Next slide, please. The project, the microfinance in Kamikin, also already mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. Kai. So, and also during the pandemic, actually before the pandemic, we have exchanged exchanges. And since it is not possible during the pandemic, we continue to exchange through online. And we are also going to have a discussion around food security in partnership with Rural Reconstruction China, and also probably better nutrition to the social media and fair trade practices. And we're going to deliver this through the online system that we're going to establish. Strengthen social entrepreneurship from seed to table through the seed banking pilot. Probably would expand it to cover Visayas and probably Mindanao. Processing, transport delivery system, and marketing. We position rural reconstruction trade for these undertakings. Next slide, please. And of course, as we envision to expand the seed banking project and through the promotion of indigenous and open women here, native vegetable and fruit to respond to the pandemic in the long run. Next slide. And also to expand the model of organic, diversified, and integrated farming in the institutions that we are. So we are also part of organizing an urban farming network. We actually have an urban garden at the top of the PRRM building. And these are composed of agricultural advocates and practitioners network, and would be eventually would eventually benefit out of the seed distribution project of PRRM. Next slide. And of course, we would want to set up the farm modules and in the peer where we have lands for learning, we have community learning centers, and make them not just a learning center, but also an earning center as well. So these are some of those areas. So next slide, Kai. We would want to reposition RR Trade, not just a shop there at the PRRM building, but to develop markets by which we would maximize online system and delivery of farmers' produce and the products from our people's organization and partners. Next slide. And we would also endeavor to position our Lagawi Highlands Rural Bank or Bank Lagawi in Northern Luzon to cater to agricultural institutions, agricultural cooperatives, and other individuals and parties that are involved in agriculture. Also, our repositioning the microfinance and digital financial inclusion in our microfinance program. Next slide. We would maximize the learning exchanges like this one, and we would be continuing our conversations on sustainability, which used to be physical, now online, and we're going to offer courses through our training institution, the Benitez Institute for Sustainable Development. Next slide. And we would want to be really involved in heightening the advocacy for the bill on poverty reduction through social entrepreneurship, through the demonstration of local social enterprises, and with the present coalition. We would endeavor to do institutional strengthening with our federations, be involved in campaign for the movement for food security, enhance our community-based primary health care activities, and involve our strategic academic and celebrate our 70th anniversary in 2022. Next slide. Okay. And I would like to end with this credo of rural reconstruction, the credo of rural reconstruction workers, institutions everywhere in the world. And let me read as a closing note. Go to the people, live among them, learn from them, plan with them, work with them, start with what they know, build on what they have. It's by showing, learn by as an integrated approach, not to conform but to transform, not release. Thank you. That's my presentation.
Thank you, Marlon. So we got a sense of PRM's theory or thinking and much of what PRM does on the ground, or rootedness, as Ed calls it, together, not PRM by itself, but together with our partner federations. From among small rice farmers, coconut farmers, rural women, fishers, and rural youth. Their very local organizations are doing all these activities and responses to the effects of the pandemic. So now we would like to open our question and answer portion. We have 3 questions already sent to us for Ed and Marlon, maybe, or for any of the participants. Farmers is 57 to 59 years. Please provide insights on how Filipino youth can be better engaged in agriculture and how do we encourage them. So that's the first. I will read 2 more questions and then maybe Ed and Marlon can come in to provide insights. What is PRM's view on this? In the interest of building resilience and sustainable food security, especially in the time of COVID, is there hope, relevance, and is it appropriate to call for migration of overpopulated and poverty-ridden urban areas back to the rural areas? And a third question, how can we help farmers in setting up a system so as not to overproduce, like what is happening up north, meaning maybe in the Cordilleras, so that they have viable means of livelihood? So these are the first 3 questions for Ed and Marlon. Encouraging young farmers, that's first. Second is, do we also support the call for migration from the urban to the rural areas? And third is, how to help farmers not to overproduce.
Okay, Ed, would you like to come first, or yeah? First is how to, sir. You want to come first, Ed?
Ikaw na. You first. Go
Okay,
ahead,
yes, yes, yes,
Marlon.
yes, sir. I think we can, with the development of agri-tourism farms, and I think we can entice the millennials to go back to the farms, especially those that are sons and daughters of farmers who actually left the farms to migrate to Manila and seek for greener pastures there. Families in the family farms. So I think there are already models where the millennials are leading agriculture as a productive undertaking. And I think the model for small land holdings of PRRM, the organic and diversified integrated farming model, is another technology that can be model to entice those the new generation, the millennials, to go back to the farms. And there are a lot of examples of farming models. I think family farming involving the young ones in the farm activities is another approach. Well, to the second question, do we support migration back to the provinces? I think that's a good idea, and I think it's a matter of policy to involve them or for government and for the business sector to develop enterprising activities and farming models by which they can actually be part of rural development undertakings and it's I think it's already an undertaking being
The-
taken by the government right now, and it was again heightened during the pandemic. What is the third question, Kai?
Avoiding overproduction.
Well, I think during the pandemic, a lot of restaurants and a lot of resorts and a lot of markets have closed, and therefore the markets were not able to absorb the produce of farmers because there is no market to begin with. I mean, if the market are the restaurants and resorts and similar markets, I think of course it will be difficult to market. Like we heard from the news about the rotting tomatoes in Ifugao, the rotting tomatoes in Nueva Vizcaya. Primarily because these are intended to be absorbed by a larger market. But that particular market is no longer there. And well, yes, of course, it's very difficult to sell. Second is that I think it's also a matter of agricultural policy to organize cropping and planting patterns, probably by regions, probably by provinces. Like, this province would produce tomato, the other would produce eggplant, and some others would produce in a way that, it's not just bulk. In one season, there's bulk produce of tomatoes, there's bulk produce of vegetables or something like that. I think it's also a matter of policy. Sir, you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, I think it's a combination of call it market mechanism and public policy. And between the two, I think the main driver is the first. Meaning, if there are when you say young, it doesn't necessarily mean young with no other option but to till the farm, but young who could migrate to work in a factory or work in a city. And what would keep them in the farm and in the community is if they think that there's income to be made there. That's one. And then also that there is a kind of a social life and not a kind of a dull, boring life, you know. That's why it's related to this whole idea of balik probinsya. You can have all kinds of encouragement, but that I know a couple of LGUs who are thinking of you. They must develop some kind of growth centers in their place, no, including housing, including like this kind of smaller farms that aggregate. Without that magnet, that attraction, you can't just push people. It's just like relocating urban poor to nearby areas outside Metro Manila. They'll go there and then still return because the work is here. Of course, earlier than that, there is this broader issue of whether we do have an effective population policy because you can't really have just growth that has no that doesn't take into account the capacity of society and the economy to absorb. I think what made not just incentives and tradition for to private produce or surplus produce has been weak. It's what has happened, like what happened with those young sold to different.
Sir, nagcha-choppy ka po, Sir Ed. Uh,
I think we're losing.
yeah.
Yeah, okay.
May I just forward one more question from the participants, and then I will give back to Isaiah, to Lisa. So she'll decide if we can have an open, a few more minutes for open discussion. So the last question, sir, is: does PRM and its partner enterprises have plans to integrate or strengthen ITC? Maybe this means information technology and communication, infrastructure, and digital modes of payment and selling to sustain the business, or are you already into it?
Yes, we would want to be involved in that, and I think it's already a product of our discussion to be online and maximize current delivery system. And we believe that even let's consider that this pandemic would end, and even with the end of the pandemic, and for longer times, I think this will already be a market mechanism. So we PRRM would be involved in the integration of this technology, and this will be a product of this will also be part of our discussion in the internal conversation that we're going to have with our partner People's Federation and establish the system. So we are serious about it. We would be part of integrating communications, online platforms, and whatever technology is available.
Okay, thank you, sir. So Lisa, if you will allow a few more minutes. So thank you to everyone in behalf of Ed and Marlon and all the trustees present here now of PRRM. Thank you to all the participants who joined us today. Thank you also to Isaiah. Lisa? Liz?
Uh, Yeah, thank you, Kai, and thank you very much to the Philippine Rural Reconstruction Movement and Ore and Marlon along with Kai. Thank you for such a comprehensive and insightful discussion on culture and social entrepreneurship. This was the sixth webinar in earlier discussion. Uh, our webinars are aimed at providing insights on in terms of how we can engage the social enterprises to actually respond to COVID and to build back better and recover. And the second objective is also to reconfigure our the SESDG acceleration platforms or platforms that were the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think this discussion has very clearly connected food security, food sovereignty, sustainable agriculture with the Sustainable Development Goals and our advocacy for the poverty reduction to Social Entrepreneurship Coalition. And with that, thank you once again to PRRM and to everyone for joining us in this discussion. And we'd also like to invite you to our 7th webinar on July 7th. This will be a webinar with Change Fusion, a social enterprise incubator and resource institution in Thailand. And the topic will be how they are surviving and redesigning themselves to sustain their operations and enhance their social impact. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us in this webinar series.